trade professionals. We are back with another news roundup, and well, hold up. We're going to introduce our hosts first. We have Andy and Lalo here in the studio. Obviously, you should know them by now. My name's Anik, and I'll be asking all the questions today and getting all the answers from these two great hosts. So let's get it started into our theme, which basically is the U.S. West Coast ports. That's the overall theme today because there's a lot going on. We've had multiple articles coming our way.
There's actually one in Canada too. So
yes, one in Canada too. So I guess it's like an overall problem. And you know what? I have a lot of questions, and I know Andy and Lalo have a lot of answers for me. So. And I'm sure you do too. So let's get it started. Our first article of the day is dock workers disrupt U.S. West Coast ports as contract talks drag on. So I am a little bit confused. I saw the negotiations, and I'm always in favor of a good faith or toward a fair agreement. But I'm just not sure what this whole situation is about. Am I understanding it right that profits have been excessively high and workers are asking for more? I'm just not understanding the topic fully correctly. So if you could please enlighten me on this round, on what this, coming from the bottom and just establishing where this even started.
Folks, this is going to be one where basically the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union is basically doing work stoppages and the labor market there on the West Coast ports. This is another deal where they're saying, they're seeing these record profits. Well, the scenario here, let's put it in perspective. What drove this initially as far as what they're saying? During the pandemic, your prices of a container jump from roughly, let's say, $2,000. I'm just going to keep it simple, but roughly $2,000 or $2,500 for a 40-foot container to $20,000 for a 20-foot container. The capacity had dropped off some, so there was pullback on some of the ships. And they wound up, whatever was there, drove up, supply and demand. That was one thing. The second thing that happened was during the pandemic era is that ports were backed up. There could be as many as anywhere from 75 to 100 ships moored off the coast of California that were waiting to get to get unloaded and loaded up and launched again. And part of the scenario there was that there was work shortages or labor shortages, if you will, and whatnot during the pandemic era. Things went through. There was another contract negotiations. Wages went up, different things, work rules and all that had changed. The problem I see right now is, again, here we're at the end of it. I can tell you this, that the prices for containers has significantly dropped. I had an email just yesterday where they were offering anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 a container on that same Pacific run there. So it's like the rates have dropped back down. So it's not like it used to be. But one of the things I have a problem with here is that the union is now going to hold the U.S. supply chain hostage like they did before. But the difference in this one is the union is binding together to basically hold hostage all of the West Coast ports.
Are you talking about, sorry, I'm interrupting you, but are you talking about the unions or are you talking about the dock, just the dock workers?
Well, that's the unions.
Yeah, it's the unions that represent the dock workers.
Attention all trade geeks. The G-Tech conference is coming to Oklahoma City and you won't want to miss it. Mark your calendars for July 30th through August 1st and join us for a jam-packed event with expert-less sessions and networking opportunities. And guess what? The Simply Trade podcast will be recording live at the event. Don't miss this unique chance to be featured on a show and share your insights with fellow trade professionals. We'll see you in Oklahoma City, where trade compliance takes center stage. Go to www.ncbfaa.org and become part of the action.
Okay, but why are they talking about dock work? My question is, why are they talking about the dock workers? It's to me, okay, I'm going to tell you what it sounds like. It sounds like the dock workers are just working and they're like taking their sweet time to do any of the processes, but it's basically the dock workers doing this. But so are the union basically telling the dock workers, hey, like slow this down?
You got it.
Or
yes, because the dock workers they're the members of the union, but it's a work slowdown. And what happens is that they're going to make sure that they'll do their job, but they're doing it very slowly. Or, hey, somebody calls out sick. Well, I can't do that. That by union rules, I can't move that truck that's in the way, or I can't, run that crane or whatever. So there's times like, well, somebody's on a coffee break. Well, it slows down the whole thing, or whatever the case may be. It's just, it's a matter of intentionally slowing down the process. Here's where I have the problem. That's just a tactic. And I understand that. The overall is, as I look at this, is that in this case, and I'm sure I'm going to make some people angry at this, but in my opinion, the union doesn't give rat's tail about anybody else of what they are dealing with in this case of the negative domino effect. It affects the truckers, it affects the rail, it affects then the consumer, if you will, because they can't get their products, the stores that are selling that or online, all of that. It's a negative domino effect. And that's just part of it. All right. They are a part, not the sole reason why, as they're trying to position themselves, they're the ones that have carried us through the pandemic. Bull hockey. I'm telling you what on that one is that they were a major part of why the pandemic was so bad. Not that they came through and patriotically came through and helped in the ports. They were part of the problem. And that's what I have an issue with, because the productivity of U.S. ports, especially on the West Coast, suck eggs. And it backed up. They can't turn a ship as fast as other ports do. So in this, they're holding us, basically the supply chain hostage. The difference in this go round is that they see all these exorbitant profits. Keep in mind, they have negotiated in the past to share in profit sharing. Well, what more do you want? I mean, the better the company does, the better they do. But instead, and here's the other thing, across the country, the average salary for a dock worker is $66,000.
I saw like an article and it said like 200, they're already getting 200,000 and they're wanting to ask for more.
But see, here's the thing. When profits drop off, is the union going to cough up some and say, well, okay, now things are bad, so we need to cut your pay? Are they going to offer that? No. It's always gimme, gimme, gimme. That's one thing. The second thing is talking about the productivity of the port. Part of the scenario would be in the ports is that the union is against automating
and also,
so many different types of positions.
I agree. And also, and now I lost my, well, this whole thing is going to make us lose money. So I think it's kind of, at this point, it's kind of stupid because, I mean, like you said, they're choosing different routes, right? So obviously people are not choosing these kind of ports. So we're losing money. Okay, they're saying we want more because we made so much more money. But now that they're here, it's like, oh, we're losing money. So like at this point, you're like equaled out. Like you can't even ask for more money now because all these things are happening and you're ultimately going to lose money now. I don't know how much, or I don't know if that's like as severe as the opposite side. But I have an important question towards this as well, because I mean, well, you described this very well because I wasn't aware of like all the, other factors that there are. And I wanted to ask Lalo about this too, because I know there's a compliance side, like all these things are, the companies that are going through these ports, like what if something is stuck or something is not getting to the place, or is it all insured? Where's this going? What are the companies going to do? Like, what is the compliance process from here?
Well, usually, I guess I guess being insured has probably no impact on this. I mean, it's slow down. It's slow down. I mean, the insurance is if it sinks in the middle of the ocean or whatever, there's damage.
But what if it's all spoiled? Or I think it said something about produce, right?
Right. Well, and that's part of the scenario. Insurance isn't going to cover that.
Yeah, they're not going to cover that. Yeah. So it's not an act of God, I guess. And even then, they still may not even cover it. But anyway, it's funny that you say that, because I was going to take the approach for this week's articles more on the trade compliance side. And so I jotted down a few notes, me and my little notes. I don't know how relevant, and I know Andy can actually help me with this a little bit, but so what would trade compliance departments need to do? One of the ones was what Andy just said, was reroute your shipments to the East Coast. So the part of the problem, though, Andy, I remember, I don't know when it was, I think, was it in the 90s or early 2000s, where there was also the strikes from the drivers, right?
Yes.
Then
right.
I think it was I'm trying to remember really hard, but I think UPS started it, or it was something.
Well, actually, as I recall, there were some things that the ports on the West Coast in particular had put in some restrictions on the truck drivers, and it was making it extremely difficult, especially for independent truckers. And there's still some regulations in there that I have an issue. The trucking regulations, that's one that we may need to get some information on and talk about. But I mean, that was part of the scenario here, where it was that if you stop and think, you've got this backup of containers and all of that. And remember, you got truckers who are showing up to pick up specific containers. Well, the container they may need is in the middle of probably 3,000 containers. They don't just go and let me just pick up the first one I can get my hands on, kind of a thing. There were the laws and regulations on, vetting, and certain truck drivers, truck drivers were certain backgrounds could or could not, have access to the port, those kinds of things. So all of this is going on to where a scenario here now, it is a negative domino effect of what the longshoremen are doing. And then with the truckers, the railroad, and as it permeates across. So, yeah, that's, I would say, to your point though, on the compliance right now needs to be getting with the logistics transportation folks of their companies.
Right. So that's what I was looking at, was that, so one of the notes that I did jot down was rerouting, like you said, to the East Coast. And I guess my point there was more like the risk of that is that the East Coast, they also belong to the same unions. And so they may, my point was the big strike from the Teamsters started with a group of Teamsters. And because they're all Teamsters, this was back in the 2000s or in the 90s. I apologize. I can't remember that when it was, but they didn't have an issue with their employer, whoever it was, but they still banded together. And so that created a huge amount of backlog on cargo for drivers anyway. This was, again, back in the day. I'm just wondering if this may trickle down to the East Coast, if everybody starts routing to the Gulf, the Gulf states in the U.S. and to the East. Could it trickle down? It may. It didn't before, because there was also a strike before for the longshoremen, right before the pandemic, I guess it was, or during the pandemic, but it didn't spill over, but it could, I guess. And so that was the only thing, but that was one of the trade compliance notes that I jotted down, just to find other routes or alternatives.
Well, I know that, for example, the port of Savannah and the Florida ports, cargo ports, and all that. They're like, bring it on. We'll work with you.
How is it going to get resolved?
So they're going to have to negotiate, right?
And on what side will it favor?
It's going to be higher costs. I can assure you, those higher costs are going to be passed down. So everybody is going to get, we won't even get a kiss out of this deal.
The contract is between the dock workers and the employers?
No, it isn't. No, it's a union that negotiates the contract.
Well, it's with the Pacific Maritime Association. That's what I was trying to look at it before. It's the PMA, or Pacific Maritime Association. Okay. But it's, normally you would be looking at it at each of the ports individually. So the Port of Oakland was working with the PMA. You'd look at the Port of Los Angeles, the Long Beach. Problem I have with this is the way that the union now they're looking at it as they literally are collaborating with all of the West Coast ports, all the way up into Canada. And then there's an article that talks about that as well.
We can actually jump right into it. So Canada came into this, and Canada, ILWU, Canada, voted heavily in favor of the strike action at West Coast ports. So that's another question I have. Why is how is Canada now really involved in this, and why are they voting in favor? Like, what is making them vote in favor of this, and what's going to happen with this? Like, where is this going to take the entire? Because I know that they could go on strike, and it said something about Vancouver, one of the biggest ports for some sort. That would be a big deal, and what could happen. So I just kind of want to mention that, and like all the outcomes and why this is happening with Canada now.
Well, you would have ships that would go into when the West Coast was backing up. What happened before? It was Southern California that was the union was striking, doing stoppages, or they just were backed up because of the pandemic. So people then were looking at routing their ships into Seattle and then on up into Vancouver. Vancouver, the cargo would be offloaded there and then moved by rail inland through Canada and then down into the States. Now, the capacity of a lot of the railroads and things of that nature were an issue. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. But see, here's where I'm saying this go round. Yeah, Canada's involved in the Port of Vancouver. And, whatever their issues seem to be, again, as some of that may be legitimate, may not. But at this point, what the ILWU is doing is leveraging their all of the ports as far as labor goes, from Southern California all the way up into Canada. And so they're doing this as an entire West Coast, whereas beforehand you had the Southern California and people were circumventing that, but and they came to an agreement eventually. Now you got the entire West Coast. That's one thing. So I see that as a collaboration, but I also consider that a collusion. And what do I mean by that? If carriers did that and got together and looked at this from a standpoint that they're going to, hold hostage to the supply chain, and basically they wanted higher prices. They wanted to be able to charge higher prices, and they did that as a collective group of carriers. That's criminal. That would be drawn up on charges that's they would be, like racketeering, price fixing, things of that nature, and there's laws against that. I look at what the union is doing with all of the West Coast ports, doing the exact same thing. They are colluding together to price fix the wage rates across the entire all those Western ports. And yet they can get away with it with quote unquote labor laws. I think that is a travesty to what they're doing to the rest of the country.
So you think, sorry, I interrupt because I just have a question. I will.
No, that's fine. I want you to do it.
So you think, I just want to understand your standpoint, the labor laws should be adjusted in this situation?
Well, it's supposed to be a scenario that if you are looking at going out on strike, okay, and the way this is done, it's not a national strike. It is a strike, in this case, of a specific location. Okay. Now they are under the, from that standpoint, but see, instead of a specific location, they're hitting all of the Western ports. You mean to tell me that every single one of these Western ports have the exact same issues? No, I see it as the union sees an opportunity, and they're, to their credit, I mean, it's a strategic move. So at this point, it's my understanding what they're doing is not illegal. It is legal what they're doing. Is it ethical? Heck no. I have
You
a
think
problem with this.
there will be a greater impact like on society from all this?
Well, it'd be a scenario. I think it'll be a negative effect because once again, you have supply shortages of, the manufacturing of, let's say construction products or medical parts or, garments or whatever the case is. So you go into stores and you're looking and gee, they got empty shelves. Why? Because they can't get their product. That's the cause. You see that today. We've gotten through it. It's gotten better. And now it's not driven by the pandemic.
Yeah, no, I definitely understand. And this is, I mean, we'll obviously have to keep an eye on this, how this will figure out. But I know it's a huge topic right now because we did see a lot of articles on this from different areas and different angles because there's so many angles, like you said, the shortages, and then there's like the people. And then there's, how the supply chain, it's literally a chain. So if the chain is broken, it's not really a good chain anymore. So yeah, this is very interesting to me, and the way it kind of figured out, and there's really nothing we can do, right? There's nothing they can do at this point. I think there's nothing they can do.
Well, I mean, just not use those coasts. I mean, you just reroute like Andy said earlier, you're going to have to just reroute to the east, and if all possible, it might be impossible, but other ports in the southern part of the United States, like the Gulf Coast states, but you just reroute and try to make it happen.
So and that might prolong the shorten the process, the whole situation, correct? Because if they're going around the port, these kind of ports that are strike or where the people are kind of striking, obviously if they're not getting any more, ships coming, they're gonna have to figure it out faster, right?
Well, you need to be able to turn some things. In general, you can't do too much about it other than what Lalo just said, rerouting some things. You need to be looking at sources other than the Western Hemisphere, being Asia Pacific. And 3, look at it and start looking at the oversight committees in Congress and in the House and in the Senate, to start putting pressure on your own, even just your own local representatives, and say something's got to be done about this, and go from there.
Yeah. Well, very interesting and very intense because there's so many factors and so many angles to this whole situation. And I really don't hope that it's going to affect the consumers too much because, like you said, we've gone through a lot with COVID and we've experienced shortages in the past. Let's not keep it that way because that is just a mess. But I'm so glad we talked about this topic because you guys did really clear some things up, and this is a little bit of a heated discussion for some. And if someone has a different opinion on this or a different angle, we would probably, I'm sure Andy would definitely love it.
I would love to have a discussion. Yeah.
Yeah, especially if you have a different opinion, right?
Or it may be also it may also be nice to hear from someone who's actually experiencing this problem and how they deal with it and how they reroute. I mean, sometimes whether you're supporting the longshoremen or you're not, it doesn't matter. What matters is I need to get my product in. I need to get it through. How am I going to deal with it? You know what I mean?
But very interesting. We're gonna wrap it up here on this topic, though my interesting fact actually is kind of goes with the topic. So it's about shipping containers, which about 90% of everything we buy is shipped in containers on huge ships, which emphasis on huge because it tells me how many containers they can carry at once, and I cannot believe this. This actually seems like a fake number. 20,000? 20,000. That a that's insane. I mean, I can't even and people are probably counting them. Like a 1 container, 2 containers, 3 containers. I mean, how long does it take for a ship to have all the containers? 3 weeks?
Well, that's the scenario of, again, the productivity of loading and offloading containers. And keep in mind, if you've got containers in a ship that will be hitting multiple ports to offload product and then onload product. So it's like not all of them come off at one point. It's like they're having to the ship knows what containers come off in the port of Los Angeles or in this one, and then they go on to the next port. So they're loading, offloading, all that. So yeah, you have 20,000 containers, and it'd be easy if all 20,000 are offloaded at one port. Makes it a lot easier, but they're not. And so, listen, the longshoremen that deal with it, it's not an easy job. Don't get me wrong. I'm not minimizing the job. The job is tough. But again, comparatively speaking, so is driving a truck. So is loading and doing distribution in warehouses and stuff like that. But yeah, those container ships, huge.
Yeah, lots of hard jobs. But again, this was a great conversation. Great things to talk about. And we're going to wrap it up here. Again, listen to our podcast. You're listening, so that's great. Give yourself an applause because you've gotten through this episode. Like and subscribe. We have our episodes on YouTube, not these ones, but the original ones. We have always things you can look at on LinkedIn. We post about our episodes, the new ones, whatever. And, once you have done that, you can join us next week again for a new news roundup. So thank you, Lalo. Thank you, Andy. And I'll see you guys next week. Bye.
Alrighty. Have a good one.
Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.